In the autumn of 1940, as German bombers pounded London night after night and U-boats prowled the Atlantic like wolves hunting in packs, Britain stood on the precipice of financial collapse. The empire that had once ruled a quarter of the globe, that had financed wars across continents and shaped the economic order of the 19th century, was running out of money. Not just short on cash, but truly, desperately broke. The Treasury vaults in Whitehall were emptying at an alarming rate, and Prime Minister Winston Churchill faced a reality that no British leader had confronted in living memory. Without American help, the war against Nazi Germany could not be won. But American help would come at a price so steep, so strategically calculated, that historians would later debate whether Britain's salvation came wrapped in the terms of its own dispossession. The numbers told a devastating story. By December 1940, Britain had spent nearly all of its dollar reserves and liquidated a substantial portion of its overseas investments to pay for American weapons, aircraft, and supplies. The United States, still technically neutral, operated under strict cash-and-carry legislation that required all belligerents to pay upfront and transport goods in their own ships. For Britain, this meant gold bullion sailing across the submarine-infested Atlantic, American securities sold at fire sale prices, and assets accumulated over generations vanishing into American hands. The British government had already transferred approximately $2 billion in gold and securities to the United States. Churchill's government had sold off British-owned shares in American corporations, dismantled investment portfolios built over decades, and even shipped physical gold bars to vaults in New York and Fort Knox. The empire was selling its future to finance its present survival. Into this crisis stepped President Franklin Delano Roosevelt with a proposal that would fundamentally reshape the global economic order. On December 17, 1940, at a press conference that would echo through history, Roosevelt introduced the concept that would become the Lend-Lease program. Using a deceptively simple metaphor, lending a garden hose to a neighbor whose house was on fire, Roosevelt presented a scheme that would allow Britain to obtain American war materials without immediate payment. The elegance of the proposal masked its revolutionary implications. Britain would receive weapons, food, oil, and industrial goods worth billions of dollars, to be paid back not in cash but in kind at some undefined point after the war. Roosevelt sold it to American public as both humanitarian necessity and cold strategic calculation. Better to arm Britain now than face Hitler alone later. The Lend-Lease Act, officially titled An Act to Promote the Defense of the United States, passed Congress in March 1941 and immediately opened the floodgates of American industrial might. Shipments began flowing across the Atlantic in unprecedented volume. Tanks, aircraft, trucks, locomotives, telephone equipment, machine tools, food, petroleum, and thousands of other items that a nation at total war required. By the war's end, Britain would receive over $31 billion in Lend-Lease aid, equivalent to hundreds of billions in today's currency. The Soviet Union received $11 billion, China over $1.5 billion, and dozens of other nations shared in what became the largest transfer of resources in human history. Roosevelt called America the arsenal of democracy, and indeed it was. But arsenals are businesses, and democracies have interests. Behind the humanitarian rhetoric and the genuine desire to defeat fascism lay a harder reality that British officials understood with growing clarity as negotiations progressed. The Americans were not simply helping an ally in distress. They were systematically dismantling the economic architecture of British imperial power and positioning themselves to inherit Britain's role as the world's dominant financial force. The terms of Lend-Lease, hammered out in exhaustive negotiations throughout 1941 and 1942, contained clauses that would have been unthinkable in any previous alliance between great powers. The United States demanded and received access to British colonial markets, limitations on Britain's post-war trade policies, and concessions regarding imperial preference systems that had protected British economic interests for generations. American negotiators, led by experienced diplomats and economists who understood exactly what they were doing, insisted that Lend-Lease aid could not be used to build up Britain's post-war export trade or to maintain what they termed discriminatory trading arrangements within the empire. The most significant demand came embedded in Article 7 of the Mutual Aid Agreement signed in February 1942. This seemingly technical provision required Britain to commit to the elimination of discriminatory treatment in international commerce and the reduction of tariffs and trade barriers after the war. For British officials, the implications were crystal clear. The Americans were demanding the dismantling of imperial preference, the system of preferential tariffs between Britain and its colonies and dominions that had been a cornerstone of imperial economic policy since the Ottawa Agreements of 1932. Lord Keynes, the brilliant economist representing Britain in these negotiations, recognized immediately what was happening. The Americans were using Britain's desperate need for war supplies as leverage to pry open the closed economic system of the British Empire and replace it with an American-dominated liberal trading order. The choice facing Britain was existential: accept American terms and survive the war but surrender economic sovereignty, or reject the terms and face potential defeat by Germany. Churchill himself wrestled with this devil's bargain. In private communications, he expressed both gratitude for American assistance and frustration at American pressure. He understood that Britain's financial weakness had transformed the traditional alliance between equals into something more resembling a relationship between debtor and creditor, between supplicant and patron. Yet, what choice existed? German armies occupied Europe from the Atlantic to the outskirts of Moscow. British cities endured relentless bombing. The Mediterranean was a contested battleground, and the Far East would soon fall to Japanese aggression. Without American supplies, without American industrial production, without access to American resources, Britain could not continue fighting. The empire's military forces, stretched across multiple continents and oceans, required a logistical foundation that British industry alone could no longer provide. Roosevelt's garden hose metaphor had been apt in ways that perhaps the president did not publicly acknowledge. Britain's house was indeed on fire, and the neighbor offering the hose was simultaneously negotiating to buy the property at a substantial discount.
The mechanics of Lend-Lease revealed the true nature of the arrangement far more clearly than Roosevelt's public pronouncements ever could. While American newspapers celebrated the program as generous aid to embattled democracies, the actual implementation demonstrated a ruthless efficiency in transferring British assets to American control. Before a single additional dollar of Lend-Lease credit flowed to Britain, American negotiators insisted on what they termed consideration, a diplomatic euphemism for payment extracted up front. The United States demanded that Britain first exhaust all its remaining dollar reserves, liquidate all remaining American securities and investments, and transfer physical assets of substantial value. This was not charity. This was a carefully structured commercial transaction dressed in the language of alliance and mutual defense. The scale of British asset liquidation between 1940 and 1942 remains staggering even by contemporary standards. American Viscose Corporation, Cortal's American subsidiary and one of the most profitable rayon manufacturers in the United States, was sold to American investors at a price British officials privately considered far below market value. Brown and Williamson, the tobacco company, changed hands in similar fashion. British holdings in American railways, utilities, mining operations, and industrial corporations, investments that represented decades of British capital accumulation, were systematically identified, valued, and transferred. The Reconstruction Finance Corporation, a U.S. government agency, often acted as intermediary in these forced sales, purchasing British assets and then reselling them to American private interests. The RFC became, in effect, a government-sponsored vehicle for the Americanization of British overseas investments. By early 1941, Britain had liquidated approximately $1 billion in American securities, and the sales continued throughout the war years. Gold shipments told an even more dramatic story of imperial wealth flowing westward across the Atlantic. In December 1940, the British cruiser HMS Emerald departed from England carrying one of the largest gold shipments in history, over 43 million pounds worth of gold bullion destined for South African vaults under American control. Additional shipments followed aboard battleships, cruisers, and specially converted merchant vessels, despite the very real danger of U-boat attack. The psychological impact of these transfers cannot be overstated. Gold had been the foundation of British financial power for centuries, the metal that backed the pound sterling and underwrote London's position as the world's banking center. Now that gold was being crated, shipped, and deposited in American vaults as the price of continued resistance against Germany. Each shipment represented not just billions in monetary value, but a symbolic transfer of financial primacy from London to Washington and New York. Beyond liquid assets and securities, the Americans extracted concessions that struck at the heart of British imperial power: access to bases and territories that had been exclusively British for generations. The Destroyers for Bases Agreement of September 1940, which predated Lend-Lease proper but established the pattern for all subsequent arrangements, saw Britain grant the United States 99-year rent-free leases on naval and air bases in Newfoundland, Bermuda, the Bahamas, Jamaica, St. Lucia, Trinidad, Antigua, and British Guiana. In exchange, Britain received 50 aging American destroyers of questionable combat value. The strategic implications were profound. The United States had secured a chain of bases extending from Canada to South America, establishing a military presence in what had been exclusively British spheres of influence. Churchill himself acknowledged the one-sided nature of the deal, noting privately that Britain had little choice but to accept terms that would have been rejected as insulting in peacetime. The technology transfers embedded within Lend-Lease arrangements further illustrated the systematic extraction of British advantages. In 1940, British scientists had developed the cavity magnetron, a revolutionary device that made practical radar possible and represented one of the war's most significant technological breakthroughs. Rather than maintain this as a British monopoly, Churchill's government, under intense American pressure and desperate for concrete military assistance, shared the technology freely with the United States. American industry, with its vastly superior manufacturing capacity, quickly began mass-producing radar systems using British innovation. Similarly, Britain shared advances in jet engine technology, sonar, anti-submarine warfare techniques, cryptography, and numerous other military and industrial secrets. The Tizard mission of 1940, which brought British scientists and their technical documentation to America, has been called the most valuable cargo ever shipped across the Atlantic. For Britain, it was a necessary sacrifice. For America, it was an unprecedented technology transfer that would fuel American industrial and military dominance for decades to come. American officials also insisted on detailed accounting and oversight that treated Britain less like an ally and more like a potentially unreliable debtor. Lend-Lease administrators required British authorities to provide comprehensive documentation of their financial situation, detailed inventories of remaining assets, and justifications for every request. American observers monitored British ports to ensure that Lend-Lease goods were not re-exported or used for commercial purposes. British factories operating with American-supplied machine tools faced restrictions on what they could produce. The empire that had once dictated terms to much of the world now submitted to American audits and American oversight of its economic affairs. British officials found the process humiliating but unavoidable. They needed American supplies more than they needed to preserve their dignity. The psychological dimension of this relationship shift cannot be ignored. For generations, British statesmen had negotiated with Americans from a position of at least formal equality, often of superiority. Britain had been the world's banker, the Royal Navy had ruled the seas, and British diplomacy had shaped international affairs. Now, British officials traveled to Washington as supplicants, making requests rather than issuing demands, accepting American conditions rather than negotiating as equals. Lord Halifax, the British ambassador to the United States, spent exhausting months navigating American political currents and pleading Britain's case to congressmen, senators, and administration officials. Lord Keynes, arguably the most brilliant economist of his generation, found himself arguing with American negotiators who understood perfectly well that Britain had no alternative but to accept whatever terms were offered. The reversal of roles was complete. America now held the power that Britain had wielded so confidently just a generation earlier. By mid-1942, the full architecture of Anglo-American economic relations under Lend-Lease had been established, and it was an architecture designed to serve American interests while meeting Britain's immediate survival needs. Britain received the weapons and supplies necessary to continue fighting, but at the cost of surrendering much of its economic independence and future competitive position. The empire was being sustained in the present by mortgaging its future to a rising power that had every intention of collecting on that mortgage in full.
The true genius of American strategy lay not merely in extracting immediate concessions from a desperate Britain, but in embedding within Lend-Lease the structural mechanisms that would guarantee American economic dominance in the post-war world. While British forces fought and died from North Africa to Burma, while British cities endured bombardment and British civilians rationed every necessity, American planners were methodically constructing the framework of a new international order that would relegate Britain to secondary status. The war itself became the vehicle through which a fundamental power transition occurred, and Lend-Lease was the instrument through which that transition was formalized and made irreversible. Article 7 of the Mutual Aid Agreement represented the cornerstone of this transformation. The seemingly innocuous language about eliminating discriminatory treatment in international commerce concealed a direct assault on the economic foundations of the British Empire. Imperial preference, the system by which Britain and its dominions and colonies traded with each other on preferential terms, had been essential to British economic strategy since the Great Depression devastated world trade. The Ottawa Agreements of 1932 had established a sterling bloc, a protected trading zone where British goods enjoyed advantages over foreign competitors, where colonial raw materials flowed to British factories, and where finished products from those factories found guaranteed markets. This system had allowed Britain to weather the Depression with less damage than many other industrial powers. It had created a relatively self-sufficient economic sphere that reduced Britain's dependence on external trade and external financing. American negotiators viewed imperial preference as an intolerable barrier to American commercial expansion. Cordell Hull, Roosevelt's Secretary of State and a fanatical believer in free trade, considered preferential tariff systems morally wrong and economically harmful. But beyond ideology lay naked interest. American manufacturers wanted access to the 500 million consumers of the British Empire. American exporters wanted to sell machinery to India, automobiles to Australia, consumer goods to Africa, and industrial equipment throughout the colonial territories. Imperial preference stood in their way, and Lend-Lease provided the levers to dismantle it. The choice presented to Britain was explicit: accept the principle of non-discrimination in post-war trade or see Lend-Lease aid curtailed. For a nation dependent on American supplies for its very survival, this was no choice at all.
Lord Keynes understood precisely what was happening and fought desperately to protect Britain's interests within the constraints of Britain's weak position. In exhaustive negotiations throughout 1941 and 1942, Keynes attempted to preserve flexibility for Britain's post-war trade policy, arguing that Britain would emerge from the war economically devastated and would require transitional arrangements to rebuild its industrial capacity and competitive position. American negotiators proved largely unmoved. They understood that Britain's weakness was temporary, and concessions granted now while Britain was desperate would be far more difficult to extract later when Britain had recovered. The Americans were thinking strategically about the post-war order, and they wanted commitments locked in while they held maximum leverage. Keynes left these negotiations exhausted and frustrated, writing privately that Britain was being forced to mortgage its economic future for the sake of immediate military necessity. The impact on British industry and trade became increasingly apparent as the war progressed. Lend-Lease agreements prohibited Britain from using American-supplied materials or equipment to manufacture goods for export. The rationale was straightforward. American taxpayers were financing aid for the war effort, not subsidizing British commercial competition against American exporters. But the practical effect was devastating for Britain's export industries. British factories, starved of raw materials and forced to entirely focus on war production, saw their export markets systematically captured by American competitors who faced no similar restrictions. Markets in Latin America that British exporters had cultivated for decades fell to American firms. Trade relationships in Asia, the Middle East, and even within parts of the British Empire itself shifted to American suppliers. Britain was winning battles but losing economic wars, defeating Germany while surrendering commercial ground to America. The financial accounting of Lend-Lease revealed additional mechanisms of American advantage. While aid came nominally as a loan to be repaid in kind, the actual terms remained deliberately vague throughout the war years. British officials repeatedly sought clarity on what would be expected after the war, what goods or services would constitute repayment, and what timeline would apply. American officials consistently declined to specify details, preferring to maintain maximum flexibility for future negotiations. This ambiguity served American interests perfectly. Britain received aid necessary for survival, but accumulated an undefined debt that could be called in under terms to be determined later when Britain would be even weaker. The uncertainty itself became a tool of leverage, keeping British planners unable to develop coherent post-war economic strategies because they could not determine what obligations they would face. Lend-Lease also accelerated the displacement of sterling by the dollar as the world's primary reserve currency. For decades, international trade had been denominated largely in pound sterling, and central banks worldwide held sterling reserves. London had been the hub of international finance, and the pound had been the currency through which global commerce flowed. Lend-Lease transactions, however, occurred in dollars. American loans to other nations were dollar-denominated. American economic planning for the post-war period assumed a dollar-based international monetary system. As the war progressed and America's economic weight grew while Britain's declined, central banks began shifting reserves from pounds to dollars. Traders began preferring dollar transactions, and the infrastructure of international finance began relocating from London to New York. Britain was losing not just wealth, but the structural position that had allowed it to generate wealth through its role as international banker and clearinghouse. The treatment of Lend-Lease goods themselves added another dimension to American advantage. Equipment and materials shipped to Britain under Lend-Lease remained technically American property. At war's end, Britain would be required to return serviceable equipment or compensate the United States for its value. The scale of this obligation was enormous. Thousands of aircraft, tens of thousands of vehicles, millions of tons of equipment and supplies scattered across Britain, across British bases worldwide, and in many cases already consumed or worn out in the war effort. The prospect of accounting for all this material and determining fair compensation created another lever for American negotiators in post-war settlements. Britain would face crushing financial obligations just as it attempted to rebuild its shattered economy and reconvert industry to peacetime production. Perhaps most significantly, Lend-Lease accelerated the psychological shift in how both nations viewed themselves and each other. American officials increasingly saw themselves as the senior partner in the alliance, the power whose industrial might and financial resources made victory possible. British officials, regardless of their historic pride or military contributions, found themselves treated as junior partners whose opinions mattered less than American preferences in strategic and economic planning. The Atlantic Charter, Roosevelt and Churchill's joint statement of war aims issued in 1941, proclaimed noble principles of self-determination and economic cooperation, but the actual relationship between the two nations increasingly resembled that between creditor and debtor, patron and client, rising hegemon and declining empire. Britain was learning the bitter lesson that financial dependence translates directly into political subordination, that economic weakness undermines diplomatic autonomy, and that imperial power cannot survive the loss of economic foundation.
The final reckoning came in 1945, as the guns fell silent across Europe and the true cost of Britain's survival became undeniably clear. Victory over Nazi Germany had been achieved. The empire remained intact on the map, and British forces could claim their share of triumph over fascism. But the Britain that emerged from the war was a fundamentally different entity from the Britain that had entered it. The nation was virtually bankrupt, its industrial infrastructure worn out from 6 years of total war production, its population exhausted, its cities scarred by bombing, and its financial reserves completely depleted.
More significantly, Britain had accumulated obligations and made commitments during the war years that would constrain its economic sovereignty for decades to come. The empire had survived, but it had been irrevocably subordinated to American power in ways that would become increasingly apparent in the immediate post-war years. The abrupt termination of Lend-Lease in August 1945, immediately following Japan's surrender, delivered a devastating shock to British economic planners who had hoped for a gradual transition to peacetime arrangements. President Truman, acting on congressional authority and domestic political pressure, simply turned off the tap. Shipments stopped, orders were canceled, and goods already in transit were recalled or had to be purchased for cash that Britain did not possess. The suddenness of this cutoff revealed the extent of British dependence. The economy had been restructured around the assumption of continued American supply. Industrial planning had incorporated Lend-Lease materials as essential inputs, and the transition to peacetime production required resources that were no longer available. Britain faced the prospect of economic collapse just as it attempted to demobilize millions of service members, reconvert factories to civilian production, and restore normal economic activity after 6 years of wartime controls and rationing. In desperation, Britain turned to Washington with a request for a massive post-war loan to bridge the gap between wartime and peacetime economy. Lord Keynes led the British negotiating team, and his experience illustrated perfectly the transformation in Anglo-American relations that Lend-Lease had facilitated. Keynes initially hoped to negotiate a grant or an interest-free loan, arguing that Britain's wartime contribution, standing alone against Hitler for a year, fighting across multiple continents, suffering enormous casualties and economic destruction, merited generous treatment. American negotiators rejected this approach entirely. They offered a loan of $3.75 billion at 2% interest, with repayment to begin in 1951. But far more significantly, they attached conditions that completed the dismantling of British economic autonomy that Lend-Lease had begun. The terms of the 1945 Anglo-American Loan Agreement represented the final capitulation of British economic independence. Britain agreed to make sterling freely convertible within 1 year, effectively ending the sterling area's protected currency zone. Britain committed to supporting American proposals for the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, institutions designed by American economists to embody American economic principles and serve American interests in managing the post-war international financial system. Britain accepted further obligations regarding imperial preference and trade discrimination, agreeing to work toward the elimination of preferential arrangements that American exporters found objectionable. In exchange for money desperately needed to avoid economic catastrophe, Britain surrendered the policy tools that might have allowed it to protect its industries, manage its currency, and preserve its economic sphere of influence. The Lend-Lease settlement itself added further burdens. In 1946, Britain and the United States negotiated a final accounting of Lend-Lease obligations. Britain agreed to pay $650 million for Lend-Lease equipment and materials that remained in British possession at war's end, a sum added to Britain's already crushing debt burden. The Americans waived payment for goods consumed during the war, but this generosity came with explicit conditions regarding future trade policy and continued pressure to open British and imperial markets to American competition. The final Lend-Lease settlement was negotiated alongside the 1945 loan, creating a comprehensive package that locked Britain into the American-designed post-war economic order with minimal room for independent action. The consequences rippled through the late 1940s and beyond. In 1947, Britain attempted to make sterling convertible as promised, and the result was immediate disaster. A run on sterling reserves forced suspension of convertibility after just 6 weeks, demonstrating conclusively that Britain lacked the financial strength to maintain an open currency system. The crisis burned through a substantial portion of the American loan and required emergency assistance, further deepening Britain's dependence on American support. The episode proved what British officials had feared. The conditions attached to post-war American financing were incompatible with Britain's weakened economic state, but Britain had no leverage to renegotiate terms dictated while it was desperate for American help. The broader dismantling of the British Empire proceeded with American encouragement and sometimes active American pressure. The United States had written into wartime agreements and post-war loan conditions the principle of non-discrimination and equal access to markets. When Britain attempted to maintain control over colonial economies or preserve preferential trade arrangements, it faced American opposition backed by the financial leverage America had accumulated during the war years. India gained independence in 1947, and while many factors contributed to British withdrawal, the economic exhaustion of Britain and American pressure for decolonization played significant roles. Throughout Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, the post-war decades saw the systematic liquidation of British imperial control, with American economic interests frequently moving in to fill the vacuum left by British retreat. The sterling balances, debts Britain had accumulated to India, Egypt, and other countries during the war by purchasing supplies with sterling that could not be converted to gold or other currencies, created another mechanism of Britain impoverishment. These obligations, totaling over £3 billion by war's end, represented claims on British resources that drained the economy for years. Britain had financed part of its war effort by essentially printing money that its colonies and allies were forced to accept, creating debts that would later have to be honored or defaulted upon. The Americans, meanwhile, had financed their vastly larger war effort through genuine productivity increases and industrial expansion, emerging from the war as the world's dominant creditor rather than a debtor struggling with obligations it could barely service. By 1950, the transformation was complete. The Bretton Woods system, designed largely by American economists and embodying American preferences, had replaced the pre-war international financial order in which Britain had played a central role. The dollar, not the pound, was the world's reserve currency, backed by American gold reserves and American economic might. International trade increasingly flowed through American-dominated institutions and according to American-designed rules. The British Empire, while still existing on maps and constitutional arrangements, had been reduced to a secondary position in an American-led international system. Markets that Britain had controlled for generations were now contested territories where American corporations competed on equal or advantageous terms. Technologies that Britain had developed were being exploited by American industries with superior manufacturing capacity and better access to capital. The narrative of Lend-Lease as generous American assistance to embattled democracies contains truth, but it is incomplete truth. The program did indeed supply weapons and materials essential to defeating Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. Without American industrial production, the war would certainly have taken longer and might have ended differently. But the program was never simply charitable aid. It was carefully structured to serve American strategic and economic interests, to extract maximum advantage from Britain's desperate circumstances, and to establish the foundation for American dominance of the post-war international order. Roosevelt's garden hose metaphor suggested neighborly assistance in an emergency, but the reality more closely resembled a calculated transaction in which the neighbor with the hose acquired ownership of substantial portions of the burning property while the fire still raged. The British Empire had survived the Second World War, but it had done so by transferring its accumulated wealth, its strategic positions, its technological advantages, and ultimately its global primacy to the United States. Lend-Lease was the instrument through much of this transfer occurred, the legal and financial mechanism that allowed American negotiators to extract concessions that would have been impossible to obtain in peacetime between powers negotiating as equals. Britain had faced an existential choice in 1940: accept American terms and survive, or reject them and face potential defeat. Churchill's government made the only rational choice available.